So I'm standing on a marsh at the edge of San Francisco Bay, and behind me you can see the bay. Where I am right now gets flooded every day with the tides when it comes up. And this is actually the edge where climate change is going to probably have the biggest impact upon California, and that is sea level rise. We've seen sea level rise over the last century and a half of maybe 8 to 10 inches, but the models forecast that we could see much, much more in the future, and that's really going to have an impact upon California. So how is sea level rise going to affect us? A couple different ways. One is we have a lot of infrastructure, things like that bridge over there. That's the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it's actually something that we depend upon for moving commerce under, moving commerce across, for people commuting, that sort of thing. You know, this levee was built to manage the kind of sea level that we had in the past, and we've got a whole set of infrastructure, whether it's the bridge, the levees, docks, piers, protected areas near houses. All those things are threatened with sea level rise. And California's coast is the site of some of the most expensive property in the country. And that's where climate change is probably going to have the biggest impact on California law, because there are millions to billions of dollars of property value along the California coast that might be subject to legal conflicts. To illustrate some of these conflicts with sea level rise, we're going to go down to Stinson Beach, where you can see really valuable private real estate, private property, right up against the public beach, and that's where the real conflicts are going to come. So here at Stinson Beach, we can see the conflict that comes up around sea level rise. We have the public beach. It's very clearly public. It's part of a state beach. And here in California, state law says that the public actually owns and controls up to what's called the mean high tide mark. As you move landward, though, that's private land. Yet it still has a lot of public functions. The dunes here have grasses that harbor species like birds. They also provide public protection for the private property. And so as sea level rises, we're going to see some tension, because that boundary is going to shift, and also we're going to have some of those public values conflicting with private values. So the dunes are technically private, but there's a public quality where they do provide a lot of other public functions. And if we look at the dunes, we see that they're protecting these houses here. So as sea level rises and those dunes get eroded away, it's not just a question where the public boundary shifts with private property, but also what duty do we have to protect these houses? What if the landowner wants to build a big armored wall to protect them from sea level rise? And that ends up affecting these public values. What if the dunes are basically gone and therefore we don't have habitat for species? Those are the kinds of issues where the Endangered Species Act comes in, public trust doctrine for land use comes in, and a lot of legal conflict is probably going to ensue. So now we're at Lagunitas Creek in Marin County, which is actually an incredible place where the coho salmon still spawn. They've struggled, but they still spawn despite all the water diversions and other things upstream. And the reason we're here is because I want to talk about how climate change is going to affect things like salmon and other endangered species. That itself is going to mean more conflict over water and how we allocate water in California. This creek here, Lagunitas, as I said, supports coho salmon. What salmon need is cold water, and they need it to flow at the right time of year. And you can see right now that the creek is really still. This is not when the salmon are coming upstream to spawn. They wait until the big flush of rains in the wintertime, and then they can head upstream, lay their eggs, and die. And then after that, of course, a new round of salmon will be born. Also steelhead are in this creek. But with climate change, we are going to see warmer waters and flows at different times of the year. And that means it's going to be tougher for salmon, which means more conflict with farmers, urban water users, and all the other things we want to use water for in California. So what we're looking at right here is a dam for the Marin Municipal Water District. And Marin's water supply comes locally. It's from rainwater rather than snow. But these dams are all over California, and they're the key to managing water for two reasons. One is that the moisture doesn't fall when we need it usually. It falls in the winter and spring in California. We usually need it in the summer and fall. And the second is that sometimes it comes harder and faster than we can manage, and we therefore need to contain that water for flood control. And in California, we don't really have enough dams and reservoirs to manage the enormous changes we're going to see with climate change. And that's why we're going to see a lot of conflict over water, not just between salmon and people, between different groups of people and how they use water. That's, I think, going to be, along with sea level rise, where we see the biggest legal conflicts is over water allocation. So while we have a lot of dams in California and the US, the biggest place we store water is actually not behind dams. It's actually in the snowpack. And this is why climate change is going to have a very, very big impact upon California water. Most of our water comes from two sources for California. One is the Sierra Nevada, where the snowpack itself lets moisture fall in the wintertime. It gets stored up there, just like it was in a big reservoir, until the spring and summer where it runs off when we need it. The second place is the Colorado River. Again, getting snow from the mountains that melts at the right time of year, flows down into the reservoirs, and then become part of California's water supply. So we actually have, as the snow level goes up because of warming, more rain falling or more moisture falling as rain, and less falling as snow. And so we have two problems. One is there's flooding during the times when it falls as rain. We have to leave less room behind the reservoirs. And the second is we actually have less moisture stored by the snowpack that we can use when we really need it. So it's not just drought, it's not just water, it's not just flooding that's an issue with climate change in California. Fire is also an enormous issue. And we're going to see twice the fire and only half the snowpack in the Sierra by the time my grandkids are my age. That means a lot of money, a lot of conflict over how we'll manage those resources, and unfortunately a lot of real risk for homeowners and the natural resources of California. So fire is going to be really different in a number of ways. We're going to have a longer fire season. We're already seeing that in California, where it starts earlier, ends later, which means it's much harder to manage those really big fires. Secondly, we're going to have different fire behavior, where erratic winds, drier, hotter conditions mean the fire is going to be blasting up the slopes faster and further than it did before. And then the third thing is that we're going to see fire in different places because the vegetation is going to change. Different rainfall, different temperature means different kinds of vegetation. Where you used to have trees, you might have chaparral and shrubs. That stuff is going to catch fire much more readily than the trees did in the past. So all three of those things mean a very different fire regime for California, different risks, and therefore, again, more legal conflicts over how to manage California's resources. Okay, we've talked about three big areas where there's going to be conflict and legal issues around climate change in California. The first is sea level rise. The second is due to water allocation and differences in when and where the water falls and whether it falls as rain or snow. The third we've talked about is fire. Those are all areas where issues of liability, public versus private interests, and conflicts between different private interests are going to play out. But there's a fourth issue that's really important for California as well. That fourth area is heat. When I first wrote about climate change in 1990, we called it global warming. The reason is that the sun's rays result in heat that gets trapped with the greenhouse effect, and that raises the temperature, and that higher temperature itself is an issue for California. I'm now down in San Diego, and we've moved from Marin County to a much hotter climate. But if you look at San Diego's climate, it's going to be getting hotter and hotter, and basically throughout California, imagine the heat of Southern California moving north so that LA starts to have San Diego's climate, Ventura starts to have warmer climate, and on up through Northern California. This is going to be a really serious issue for two reasons. One, it's going to increase demand for electricity because so much of our electricity is to meet two big needs. One is for air conditioning. Hotter temperatures mean you need more air conditioning. The second is that we need more groundwater pumping for agriculture, for water. We talked about the water issues earlier. Well, this increase in electricity demand is going to mean another area of conflict and also some really serious public health issues. So what does it mean to have a lot more electricity demand in California? Well, a couple things. One is that if we produce that power from traditional sources, we're going to be causing greater air pollution, which has public health effects, while still exacerbating the problem of climate change because we're putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The second is that the timing of when we need electricity is going to shift. So really, what we need to do to deal with that problem is two things. One, we need to really shift to renewable energy sources, which California is a leader in doing already. But that means some more conflict about power plants and where they get sited and what impacts they have upon wildlife in the desert, whether we build rooftop solar, that kind of thing. But that's going to be an area of a lot of legal conflict, and it already is. So the increased heat is going to mean that we're going to have some really serious public health problems. More smog, and also heat-related problems for especially the elderly and those who don't have air conditioning and the kind of cool climate we have here at the coast. What's interesting is that may mean more problems for the coast than inland, because a lot of coastal communities don't have air conditioning. We've seen some really serious problems with heat strokes and heat waves. Russia had between 10,000 and 50,000 people die from a series of increased heat effects a few years ago. In LA, we're projecting to go from maybe 10, 15 days a year of extreme heat to maybe 60 or 70 days of extreme heat. And in some areas, we'll probably have more than 100 days per year where the temperature's more than 90 or 95 degrees. So while this is not necessarily an area of legal conflict, it's going to mean that society's resources are going to be having to address this problem of vulnerability of populations. So to summarize, we've got these big issues for climate change in California. We have, the first issue, sea level rise. It's up and down the California coast. The second issue is water allocation because of the changes in how precipitation will fall as rain or snow and the timing of it. Third issue is fire. Really big issue, a lot of concerns about where we build and how we manage fires with this new landscape. And then finally, heat itself is going to cause problems because of increased electricity demand for air conditioning and groundwater pumping, and also because of the vulnerability of our citizens. To conclude, climate change in California is a really important issue. It's the defining issue of our time, and it will be driving a lot of legal conflict in the years to come. So if you have further questions or interest in it, check out www.timduane.com or contact me. I'd be happy to help you address some of those concerns. Thank you.